Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special members edition and Halloween extravaganza as we talk about vampires, Nosferatu, bloodsuckers. Where did they come from? We want to go into this just a little bit in the spirit of the holiday season. And how far do vampires proper go back? Well, first of all, you have to remove yourself for just a moment from the modern mindset of what we think of as vampires, because we are going to get to that, and we're going to get to why we have that in our heads. But going way back in time, vampires are generally part of the undead. And this is, even in the ancient times, something that people used to explain the world around them, right? And really what we're talking about is the undead. Well, what are the undead? The undead are people who have died, or corpses that have come back to life and been reanimated. Whether they hold the psychic and memory attributes of those who inhabited the body beforehand, or whether they are controlled by evil forces, suffice to say that creatures rising up from a tomb, from a graveyard, are considered the undead. And that really is the basis for most of, for a lot of our monsters, not just zombies and vampires, but ghouls and things like that. But we're on vampires right now. And so that idea of the undead, of people coming back from beyond the grave, is a trope that happens in ancient times, and it even moves into medieval times. And you can see on this great graphic here next to me that, especially in the medieval period, death was considered a part of life. This is part of the culture, part of the religion, and for different places and different times, the death of someone could be very common because of the disease, the low birth rates and birth survival rates, and life expectancy, right? So death is a very common part. And so people are going to, starting in the Middle Ages and moving into the early modern era, people are going to try to explain the unknown or natural phenomena with the supernatural. When folks go missing, or if someone gets sick with a particular type of disease, or if there's an epidemic, or weird things happen in the middle of the night and you think you see something, rather than developing a logical excuse for that, people are going to turn to the supernatural. And that is where most of our monster stories really begin, is in the medieval period and in the early modern period. In the medieval period, it was sort of considered a part of life. As we get into the early modern period, and especially in the 18th century, it becomes part of the folklore of stories to be told, not just as warnings or as explanations, but as entertainment. And so, again, depending upon which culture you're talking about, depending upon where you're at, how do you become a vampire? A specific vampire, right? So, again, this has to do with an animated corpse. You could have been a very bad person in life, and when you died, the evil within you that communed with greater evil spirits was animated by those spirits, and you simply rise out of the grave. Sometimes you could get bitten by another undead creature, a vampire, that would transfer that evil animating spirit to you. And there were even some legends that a corpse jumped over by a dog or a cat were at great danger of becoming the undead or a vampire. So how do you prevent someone from becoming a vampire if it's going to come from a corpse? What can you do with the corpses? Well, this is probably the most interesting to me personally aspect of what we're going to look at, because people come up with all sorts of ways to ward off the creation of an undead creature. And, that if they're going to rise from the grave as the undead, perhaps the best means to prevent that is to keep them in the grave. And so this graphic next to me is from an excavation that was done, and you can see the skull has had an iron spike driven through it, pinning it to the ground so that the dead literally cannot rise from the tomb. Pretty gruesome, but there have been excavations where metal pieces have been found in bodies and things like that. You can also, of course, just take the extra step of cutting off the head. If you cut off the head, then the spirit that inhabits the body is going to be able to leave much easier, and you want to put the head, perhaps you could still bury the head in between the legs, or you may just toss it into the woods somewhere to totally separate those and prevent something like that from happening. There's always the good old-fashioned version of just burning the corpse. And again, depending upon the culture and the society, that may not be what you want to do. It may be a matter of returning to earth. And And sometimes you could just reposition or determine how you bury the body. Bury the body face down, bury the body vertically upside down so that it would be difficult for them to rise. And sometimes if you don't want to do that sort of thing, you can just put a warning or an inscription. And this really neat graphic is of a Scandinavian tombstone upon which are written in runes some really fascinating, basically, magic that says nothing will rise from this tomb because the forces of the universe through these runes are transferred to keep whatever's inside. Really good stuff. Maybe we should look into that more often. So moving on into the 16th century, in the 1500s, there was a fellow in Transylvania, a member of the aristocracy, the very high aristocracy, by the name of Vlad III, who came to be known as Dracul, or son of the dragon. And he sort of got a bad rep because he fought so hard against the invading forces, right? You have to defend your country, and to do that, sometimes you have to get a mean, nasty reputation. And so the people he captured alive, he would impale upon wooden spikes out in front of his camp and on the borders of his land as a warning to others to not come in. Of course, we know that this term, Dracul, evolves into something that we all know, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But we've got to fit him in here since that is the historical and etymological origin of the name Dracula. Now, speaking of Eastern Europe, moving into the 17 and 1800s, this is really where we start to get the idea, where it starts to shift from just a fear of the undead into something that is much closer to the vampire that we think of, the ghoul that rises with the fangs and devouring flesh and drinking blood and things like that. And there was this, the only word for it is a craze in Eastern Europe around the 1700s of the strigoi, or the upir, that were undead creatures that would come up from the ground and were bent on vengeance. They could consume flesh. They would harass and annoy old family members or old enemies or something like that. This is where we get, drinking human blood. And as I said, during this time period, it's sort of a craze. If you want to use a parallel that's sort of close, the witch trials in Salem in America in the early 1600s, we had this craze where we thought everyone was a witch and we put them on trial, and several women and one man were burned at the stake or killed because they were found guilty. It's sort of the same thing there in Eastern Europe, only it was vampires instead of witches. I'm honestly not sure which is cooler. You'll have to do more research and determine that on your own. But this Eastern European idea of vampires, of strigoi, as things happen in this time, sort of starts to shift slowly westward until it gets into France and what's now Germany and in England. And the word that we have, vampire, comes from the French vampire. And so it's with the French that it really begins to see this pop culture, sort of this approach as not just a warning, not just as folklore, but as entertainment. And it first appears in 1734 in England in English. And, the English, having their own rich folklore that goes back into the Celtic past and things like that, start to mesh and merge some of these Eastern European ideas with some of their local folklore of creatures walking through the night, corpses coming to life and things like that. And it becomes, in the 18th and especially moving into the 19th century, incredibly popular. This sort of parallels a fascination with the occult, which hopefully you watched in one of our other programs recently that Leslie Jones did for us. But this belief in the occult and that popularity of that, vampirism and stories about vampires begin to fit and mesh perfectly into that Victorian world of the macabre and death and what comes to be known to us as horror. And of course, with things like novels also just coming into play, literature plays a huge role in how the concept and the idea of the vampire develops. And the ideas that we have of the vampire today really begin to be set by this French and British literature. One of the first vampires in literature is from a 1748 poem that simply mentions, an undead creature that happens to drink blood. In 1819, we move into a story called The Vampire by John Polidori. And this sort of begins the process of people taking vampires and being something that is very, very popular. Then we have, the book called The Vampire, and this sort of begins to set that vampires not as weird creatures on the fringes of society, but this aristocratic person trying to hide who they really are, and this erudite, gentlemanly, tuxedoed type of person who turns out to be an evil vampire, right? And it sort of begins to lend that air of aristocracy and refinement to a vampire that traveled on for at least the next 100 years. And of course, part of vampire literature has in it the idea of a female vampire. This goes back into Celtic folklore and French folklore, and sort of ties into witchcraft, right? The idea that there is something alluring and yet evil about women, especially evil women who can lure the innocent into their traps and get them. La Morte Amoureuse was a French book that first sort of established a female vampire and set that tone for the vampiress and this mix of the very alluring, very feminine, yet very dangerous type of vampire that we also see carry forward into pop culture. In 1872, a book called Carmilla is written, and instead of making it into a monster, so this sort of sets the vampire up in that sympathetic character. Oh, woe is me, I have been trapped in this life, and would that I could live and even die. And yet now I'm a vampire and I'm forced to live this life. It sets up, again, another trope common in vampire literature, that it's something that is to be regretted, and we're supposed to at least sympathize with this character and maybe even feel a little bit sorry for them, even though they are going around sucking the blood out of people and killing them and consuming their flesh and turning them into vampires as well. We're still supposed to feel something, and this is the first novel that does that. Now, moving into 1897, we finally get the granddaddy of all vampire novels, Bram Stoker's Dracula. In 1897, of course, Dracula is the title character, and that's where he gets the name. Remember old Vlad Dracul? Well, Dracula comes. He's a Transylvanian count. He lures people into his castle, and it's a very interesting book. It takes all these tropes that have been building this erudite, gentlemanly person. There's even, feminine vampires in this. There's a sense of Victorian horror. There's the occult. There's the macabre. And again, it's set in Eastern Europe, right? Sort of that birthplace of vampirism. And Englishmen have traveled to this area, and it ties everything together. It's the vampire novel. We've got, stakes being driven into the heart. We have people sucking blood. We have the fangs. We have the gentlemen. We have the vampire experts. We have crucifixes. We have garlic. We have holy water. We have all the things with that classic trope of being a vampire that builds up, and Dracula begins to establish what we here in the early 21st century think of when we think of vampires. There's lots of literature and, of course, lots of TV shows and movies that have been adapted to that. But I bet when you think of vampires, you think of Dracula, and you immediately think of what's set up in this fantastic and groundbreaking novel by Bram Stoker. Now, to talk a little bit more about the importance of Dracula and how vampirism and this pop cult phenomenon has pervaded our very society and how that got started, we're going to talk to a couple of different folks. The first person we're going to speak to is Dr. Mark Waddell of Michigan State University, who teaches history and anthropology and has done a lot of work and research on the idea of vampires in literature and in history.
Thank you so much for being with me today, Dr. Waddell. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your research?
Sure. So I'm Mark Waddell. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. My background is in the history of science and technology and medicine, but I also study the history of the occult and magic. Most of my expertise is in the 16th and 17th centuries, and so magic, medicine, and science were really closely interconnected in that period, so my interests have kind of broadened from there.
So can you tell us a little bit about how the legend of vampire and folk beliefs in general kind of allow people to explore the natural world around them through these like supernatural things?
A lot of vampire folklore is really about helping people come to grips with as well as helping people to deal with the anxieties around death, and specifically what comes after death. So, and of course, this is another universal human preoccupation. So there's a couple things, right? So when we look at the history of death and dying, one thing that happened with some frequency was people being buried alive. This was actually surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly common, actually. So, today we have sophisticated medical technologies that help us understand when someone's heart has stopped beating, when someone's brain has stopped functioning, which we interpret as death. But in the past, without those technologies, it wasn't always easy to determine if someone was actually dead. There are certain illnesses, certain substances and poisons that someone might have ingested that could cause them to fall into a state that might resemble death, where they are paralyzed, they are breathing very shallowly, their heart rate slows. And so it did happen that people were buried alive. And what's interesting is the way in which different religious groups and different human communities found and created practices to deal with that problem. So, as one example, in some religions and some cultures, it's common for people to sit with the dead for a number of days after death. And this is seen as a chance for people to say their goodbyes, to kind of just be with their loved one after they've died. But it also serves another purpose, which is if that person isn't actually dead, they're going to wake up at some point in, say, 24 to 48 hours. And so really, a lot of these practices were evolved because people wanted to make sure that their loved ones actually were dead. There are stories from the 18th and 19th centuries of cemeteries in places like England and France, where people were buried with a little bit of string coming out of their coffin and running to a bell outside. And the idea was if you woke up in your coffin and you've been buried alive, you could pull that string and it would ring that bell, and someone hopefully would be waiting to make sure you were dead. So there's all these elaborate practices. And so the reason I'm talking about that is because this was the experience people sometimes had of they would return to a loved one or someone who had died. They would return to their body months or maybe even years later. It was not uncommon for people, because space was at a premium, it was not uncommon for the body of, say, a child or someone like that to be placed in the coffin of someone who had already died. So you would open the coffin, and sometimes people would find scratch marks on the inside of the coffin because someone had been buried alive. So that sort of visceral experience, we can understand, right? The horror someone would feel of, did I bury my parent or my spouse or my child while they were still alive? That's a truly horrifying thought. But if we can instead reimagine this as they rose from the dead, right? They were dead. We didn't make a mistake, but that something happened to them after death that caused them to reanimate, to come back to life. And that's why we find these scratch marks on the insides of coffins. There's also other kind of physiological facts about bodies, what happens to people after death, that I think helped to create or to support some of this folklore. So it's not uncommon for people buried in coffins, if you return to that body some weeks or months later, the body has probably shifted. And that has to do with things like gases caused that are emitted as the body begins to decompose. That can change the orientation of the body. Muscles and tendons can, through things like rigor mortis, can tighten and then loosen, meaning that sometimes you might open the coffin and the body is now lying on its side or lying in a different position than when it was originally buried. And then there's the fact that our hair and our nails continue to grow after death. And so there are stories of people, again, opening coffins and finding bodies with very long nails and very long hair, which we would interpret as markers of life, right? And then so people would be wondering, well, this person has been alive all this time. Have they been leaving their coffin? Anyhow, so there's all of these real lived experiences around death and dying and the natural processes that happen to the bodies of those who have died that can and probably did lead to the foundation for some of these myths. The idea that some people after death don't rest, that they instead return to life in some way, and they might escape their coffin, they might go prowling around. So that's, I think, kind of interesting that there's these sort of real biological and physiological things that might have sort of spurred the creation of some of these folklores around the undead, essentially, or the risen dead. There's also one of the interesting themes in a lot of vampire folklore is this notion of infection. The idea that vampires can basically infect other people, living people, with this curse or this disease or whatever it is, and turn them into vampires themselves. And this idea is really common in our modern understandings of the vampire folklore. It was in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But that idea actually is very old, that the dead could somehow infect the living. And again, there are cultural practices and medical beliefs surrounding that idea. In the past, cemeteries and places where the dead were interred were always situated outside of communities. So a cemetery or a graveyard was never inside a town or a city. It was always outside. And there are reasons for that. There are practical reasons for that. Things like cemeteries didn't smell great. But there was also a prevailing medical idea that dead bodies, as they decompose, give off basically bad air. And this idea and this bad air was thought to be responsible for things like plague and cholera and other infectious diseases. And so that's why people tried to keep the bodies of the dead at a distance, because there was an actual fear that that bad air given off by those bodies could infect, could sicken living people. So there's another sort of bit there that I think explains some of the fears and anxieties around vampire folklore. And if we think about the European context specifically of vampire myths coming out of, say, Eastern Europe especially, these are areas that experienced huge amounts of epidemic disease for centuries. So things like the plague, right, which ripped through Europe beginning in the 14th century, actually 13th century, and killed huge amounts of people, and then kept reappearing every few years. It became endemic. Those of us living through a global pandemic can probably relate to these persistent fears about infection. The idea that someone could infect you with something that would then kill you. That was such a deeply rooted part of the European psyche. I think that also plays a role in shaping these vampire myths, this fear that the dead can somehow return to infect people who are still alive.
What were vampires portrayed as, and what they represented before the novel Dracula? Because with Dracula, we have this suave, sophisticated aristocrat. But before then, it seemed to be that it was more peasants that were portrayed as vampires, and that it was just someone's family member has come back from the dead. So how does this change kind of represent the European, ideas of what is dangerous or what could infect them, or what they kind of represented to the culture?
Again, it varied from place to place, which is also kind of interesting. So even though the idea of vampires or people rising from the dead is pretty common. The explanations people had for why that happened tended to vary pretty widely. So in places like Poland, people believed that the bodies were themselves animated by some sort of ghost or spirit that was itself evil. And so it wasn't the actual person themselves who had returned to life. It was this sort of evil spirit that was manipulating and controlling their body. And they had specific ideas. There were specific individuals who were born at certain times or who had certain characteristics who were at risk for being possessed by these spirits. And there's actually some really cool archaeological discoveries of so-called vampire burials where people in these communities presumably believed that this particular person was at risk for rising again as a vampire. So they would place certain items in their grave with them, or they would do certain things to their bodies after death to make sure that they couldn't rise again. That's one aspect of it. I think what makes the story of, or the idea of vampire so horrifying is the idea of, people that one knows returning after death and being fundamentally malevolent or violent, right? The sort of idea that the people that we love or people that we know could return to us, which would be wonderful, but they've returned as a monster essentially. And I think that is, again, a kind of deeply rooted psychological sort of impetus for a lot of these folklores. And part of what the vampire myths were intended to address, I think, was this fear of that the people that we love might change and become harmful to us or frightening to us. And there are again sort of variations, regional variations in terms of what vampires were able to do, supposedly. Sometimes they would drink blood. That was how they would sustain themselves, but that isn't by any means necessarily the rule when we look at older vampire folklore. Sometimes they might kill farm animals, right? And again, that's a way to explain kind of disastrous and horrifying circumstances. If you find your livestock destroyed, you might think, well, what caused that? Was it wolves? Was it something? Or was there, some sort of supernatural element to it? Yeah, and I think that's these sorts of really deep-seated anxieties about not just death, but the transformation of people that we know and love into something fundamentally kind of dark and dangerous and frightening is a really important part of these myths. Vampires were just one element of this supernatural world that people believed to exist, that also included ghosts and spirits. It often included witches, not in the sort of fun Halloween witch that we have today, but worshippers of Satan who killed babies and did all sorts of horrible things. People who practiced magic, which might be potentially harmful. These are all part of the day-to-day reality for most European people. And so vampires were just a part of that, and not even necessarily the most frightening part of it. But what's interesting, and what Stoker found when he began sort of researching this, is how deeply embedded these stories are and how far back they go. And that in these little regions, towns, and villages, they would elaborate on and build up these stories over time. And that's what, when Bram Stoker began doing his research, he had a gold mine of these traditions, these superstitions and folklore to draw on. And then, as you point out, he did something really different with it, for which he received a fair amount of criticism over the years as well.
So how has society, continued with this idea of a vampire, but also, as we were just saying, it's changed a lot as well. So this, kind of destructive creature that's come back from the dead then kind of changes into this suave, sophisticated immortal. and then has continued to this day with, probably Twilight is the most famous of the early 21st century novels. So why do you think that society continues to have this fascination with vampires?
It is a really good question because, yeah, the original idea of vampires was truly horrifying, right? These were not suave, elegant, sophisticated creatures. These were basically scavengers coming back from the dead. Yeah, and so even Stoker gets a lot of credit and a lot of blame for creating the modern conception of the vampire story, but vampires existed in European literature before Stoker. So we can go back to the 18th century and even further to find in the 19th century these Gothic romances, right, which were very common, which had elements of darkness and danger to them, as well as eroticism, which was very new for the time as a kind of literary style. And we see representations of vampires there as well. And that probably also influenced Stoker's writing too. So it was sort of evolving over time, these ideas of, and specifically male vampires preying on young women was a theme in 18th and 19th century literature that Stoker inherited to a degree, and that then, of course, continued after Stoker. And yeah, we get, into the 20th century portrayals of, in particular, the figure of Dracula as, right, this sort of sophisticated immortal figure. And then, people like Anne Rice, who in the 1980s was writing Interview with a Vampire, right? She is often credited with really giving us the kind of late 20th century idea of vampires as young and beautiful and sexy. And that in turn led all the way to Twilight and its sparkly vampires, right? And that I think is really interesting, that we went from these sort of disgusting carrion eaters, scavengers, truly horrific figures, to these sort of late 20th century and 21st century vampires who were young and attractive and who will live forever. And I guess that's part of the appeal, right? The sort of idea of eternal youth, and all sorts of people in terms of, authors and screenwriters and so on have tried to find ways to make vampires more palatable and more appealing. They're no longer necessarily preying on humans, right? They're subsisting on animal blood, or they don't even need blood anymore, or whatever. So we found ways to kind of sanitize this idea of the vampire and to turn it into, just young, hot, immortal people, which is really what Twilight did, right? So I would say it has a lot to do with our fascination with youth, and the idea that you can not only be young and beautiful, but you can stay young and you can stay beautiful forever. And isn't that wonderful? I guess. Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with why it has persisted. The anxieties and the sort of fears and the interest in death and vampires seems to have really faded away, especially in the past 10 or 20 years. We no longer tend to see vampires as frightening, right, creatures, or even as the undead. So that's also kind of interesting.
Yes, it seems like the vampires have kind of moved to the protagonist side of the script, if you will.
Yeah, right. I mean, we have vampire heroes, which would have been unthinkable, right, back in Bram Stoker's day. So yeah, I do think it is really interesting how, collectively we've taken these stories and we've really changed them, and they've evolved in lots of different ways, and which is the mark of a truly and something that can last, right? I think it's really interesting that the ideas of vampires, the idea of the vampire, has survived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's still with us. It still shows up not just every Halloween, but on all kinds of TV programs and movies and books and things like that. So
even Sesame Street has the Count.
very true, right? Yeah, and we managed to make the Count into just a sort of fun figure for like little kids. So yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing such interesting insight into just humans and the history of humans and how we really aren't that different. We still have the same fears and anxieties that, well, people hundreds or thousands of years ago had, and we just try to deal with them perhaps in different ways and perhaps some in ways that are not so different.
Right. Yeah, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay, now next we're going to speak with Dr. Jill Galvin, who is at Ohio State University, and she's a little bit more niche and maybe can give us a little more detail on the occult. She studies the occult, Victorian literature, and how all that plays, and this is really great because it shows us the roots of what we think of as that classic vampire storyline.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with me today to talk to us a little bit about the history of vampires. Could you please introduce yourself and tell our viewers a little bit about your work?
Yeah, sure. I am Jill Galvin, and I'm an associate professor of English at The Ohio State University, where I've been teaching for a while. I teach Victorian literature, which is British 19th century literature. So what we're talking about today, Dracula, falls at the very end of that period in the 1890s. But my area of specialization is the whole period, and also a little bit of the 20th century as well.
Yes, which includes Dracula, one of the most famous vampire books. So could you tell us a little bit about Dracula and how it reflects the times that it was written in?
So Dracula it reflects the times in quite a few ways, in fact, innumerable ways. I would say that it's one of the narratives of the period that is most written on by literary scholars as being an allegory of something in the culture. It's one of the most, I think, proliferative texts for readings of it being an allegory of something else. And that can be something political and social. It can be something related to gender. It can be something related to science, to religion, to ethnicity. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of different ways that you can think about the way that it reflects culture, and we can talk about some of those. But for instance, one of them would be that in the 1890s, so Dracula is written in 1897, in the 1880s, 1890s, a figure arises called the New Woman. And you can kind of think of her as a proto-feminist figure who represents the desire to have different kinds of vocations for women outside of motherhood and marriage. So paid work, and also a kind of figure of feminine agency, and just a kind of latitude of action. And sometimes also associated with feminine sexuality, for instance. And a lot of times people read Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra in Dracula as figures of different forms of the New Woman. Mm-hmm. Mina being a typist, being the working woman, and Lucy Westenra being supposedly oversexed, and so being a figure of sexual agency that was associated with the New Woman. It also, the narrative very much too reflects the fact that by the end of the 19th century, science as a profession and a kind of way of looking at the world, an empirical way of looking at the world, had really formed in the Victorian period and become professionalized by the end of the century when Stoker was writing. And if you think about the text of Dracula and the way that it's all these collated documents in order to evidence this phenomenon of Dracula and to try to investigate it, a lot of times people see the narrative as informed by that empiricist spirit that's arisen over the age. Those are just two ways. I could talk about so many more, including all the technologies in the novel, the camera, the Kodak camera, the telegraph, the typewriter, the phonograph, the railway. It's very much a kind of narrative of the times in that way too.
As you were saying, not only is Dracula about vampires, it also features hypnotism, spiritualism, and conjurings. So why do you think that the occult during the Victorian period was so popular?
what's called the phenomenon of modern spiritualism, which was the seance craze, where people would just sit around and try to contact ghosts, and also the popularity of mesmerism, which is hypnotism, really arose mid-century, so few decades before Dracula. And that roughly, it was a little bit preceding, but it roughly coincided with Darwin's discovery of, or rather publicizing of the mechanism of evolution and natural selection, which introduced what people talk about in the Victorian period as the age of doubt, right? This really fundamental existentialist challenge against religious ways of reading creation, life, and particularly human life and human superiority to other animals. And so it caused a lot of consternation, at least among, people who would have been reading about these scientific theories, which at the time, science was more popularized before the end of the century, when, again, as I said, it became more professionalized. But your kind of lay reader would have known about natural selection more so than, say, would be today if it were a new discovery. And so it was really confounding. It was really disturbing. And so a lot of times what scholars say is that people reached for different ideas of continuity of human being in the afterlife. And so they reached for a kind of idea of spirituality. So that's one answer. Another answer is that the idea of mesmerism or hypnotism had been around since like 100 years before Stoker. And that was where you can control somebody through trance. There was actually a figure named Mesmer at the end of the 18th century, and his theories become elaborated over the 19th century into different kind of spiritual and occult forms. And then the last reason I would give would be the rise of the different technologies that I was just mentioning. When you think about how profound a change in ideas of communication, even the telegraph would have been, right? Like that you have someone in one part of the area speaking to somebody else at a distance through Morse code. That was in the 1840s. And then in the 1870s, you have the telephone. And then in the 1890s, you have the wireless telegraph, which is what we call now radio. And when you think about these at a distance forms of communication and how occult they would have seemed at the time, a lot of times people now, scholars will talk about, they'll trace parallels in the writings of the time between the way people talked about these at a distance technologies and the way they talk about the occult. So when you think about how mind-bending it would have been for people, I think it would have made that slippage to the occult a little bit more available.
Next year marks the 125th anniversary of the publication of Dracula. So in your opinion, what is it that makes this specific vampire story so successful?
In some ways, Dracula is very much like Frankenstein, in that our popular cultural pickup of the tale is different from the original tale. When you read the actual book, you find that it's very different. One thing that I would say would be that I feel like the idea of that high-class vampire has been taken up in popular culture in a very different way, actually, than it is in the book, where he and Mina Harker have a relationship, have a love affair, which never happens in the book. In fact, Mina is just one of his victims. But what we've done as a culture is to turn Dracula into, kind of like Satan in Paradise Lost, into this kind of interesting sufferer who does evil, right? Mm-hmm. And we have a name for that in literary studies. It's called the Byronic Hero, which also, again, comes out of the 19th century. And I mentioned Byron before, coincidentally writes or gives the germ of the story for the vampire, or maybe not coincidentally. And the Byronic Hero is this kind of outcast, outlaw, destructive, self-destructive, and other destructive sufferer that we are drawn to, this kind of male figure. And I think we turned Dracula into that a little bit, which again is very different from the way he's in the book. He's just a monster in the book. Absolutely. That's all he is. But I also think it's something about, to go with that idea of him, us giving him a personality, his suaveness, his seductiveness, which again is just purely sexual, raw animal prey in the book, we've turned it into this kind of refined attractiveness in our lore. The other thing I'd say about why Dracula endures is we very much, I think it's about the ambiance and the setting. When you think about our sense of Dracula, one of the immediate things you see is the castle, right? And which is only, again, if you read the book, only the very first part of the story. It is exciting. The castle is exciting in the story because Jonathan Harker gets caught in there. But much of the novel is not about, it's actually in London. It's not in that Transylvanian castle. So I think the ambiance that Stoker establishes at the beginning of the novel is very important for the endurance of the text or of the figure. What Stoker is doing is a kind of a modern day at the time in that context, right? Late Victorian spin on the epistolary novel, which the epistolary novel is a novel that's in epistles or letters and kind of strung together letters. And what he does is to do that in the form of Mina Harker takes everybody's documents and she strings them together, right? And so everybody's telegrams and her own typewritten discourse, her diary, Jonathan's diary, Seward's phonograph diary, and she collates them. She's a secretary. So I think that one of the things that people have talked about with Dracula that we haven't mentioned when we think about all these cultural allegories and influences is really how interesting the form of the novel is as well.
The novel itself, even the way it's written is so important to the story as well.
Yeah, and if you look, there's a little beginning, there's like a little what's called an epigraph, which is the little beginning material. But I think there's an epigraph before the first pages, and there's also an ending postscript. Who is it? I can't remember who writes that postscript. Is it Jonathan? Yeah, I think it's Jonathan Harker. And both of those indicate they draw the reader's attention to the documents themselves. And about the authenticity of what they record. So if you look at that epigraph in the ending, you'll see a self-consciousness about the form and about the form as evidence, which I think goes back to that idea of empiricism too. The novel is very conscious of itself as documenting something as accurate and truthful, which is very kind of scientific and very of the age. Yeah, it's and people have written as well about the form. I think that's another area of scholarly interest as well.
Now you mentioned the Eurocentricness of Dracula and that idea of vampires, and briefly mentioned all other cultures seem to have this idea of not necessarily a vampire, but a blood-sucking creature. Is there anything that you could add about that and for vampires in other cultures in the history or literary work of that?
Well, one of the things that I have done some research on in the past is the way that Stoker may have been aware of the idea of the Indian, that is the Asian conjurer, and been aware of Indian vampire lore, which again would have worked differently, and I think from the white supremacist British perspective would have looked very sinister, right? And I think that then is transmuted into the Gothic of this novel. But once you start thinking about vampires, you can see them in other places. One like fun factoid is that that John Polidori, who wrote The Vampires I mentioned before, was the uncle of Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And if you think about Goblin Market, this mid-century text, it's got a very vampiric feel to it.
Yeah.
Right? So this idea of kind of seduction, which is associated with a kind of maleness, right? But that kind of deprives of life. So you can think about these more figurative forms of vampirism as well.
Interesting. You know, once you kind of have that idea, you can start to see it show up in other places.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
So, vampires, do they suck? Yes, but they're supposed to. And in the late 20th century and early 21st century, our pop culture is bombarded with the idea of vampires. And it's not just Dracula anymore, even though a really cool movie came out in the 90s. We have The Lost Boys, we've got Twilight, we have Lestrange, An Interview with a Vampire, we've got Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Lots and lots of vampires just keep coming, and people keep finding new ways to tell stories using this basic fundamental trope. Now, today, we're pretty sure that actual vampires don't exist, but there are even sort of clubs and groups, certainly that dress as vampires, but sort of they've totally submersed themselves in the vampire lifestyle, you could say. And even comedy is no hideout from what vampirism could be. If you want to see a great show, go check out What We Do in the Shadows, sort of a modern take on vampires who have been along and have seen too much, but they're still unfamiliar, sort of doddering old people with modern technology and modern ways. Give that a try. There's lots of other movies you can do, but I would recommend, if you're going to do one thing, just go purchase or check out a copy of Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's the classic. It's the one that sets everything up, and it would be perfect Halloween reading. Folks, that's all that we have time for today. We're so glad you could join us. We hope you've enjoyed this brief look at vampirism and the history of vampires and how it's influenced everything we do today in terms of pop culture, movies, television, and even comedies. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, take care, and have a happy Halloween.